In the acknowledgement of God's presence here and now, let us pray. Father, Mother God, we give thanks for this opportunity to be open to the awareness of your presence here in this moment. We invite you into our consciousness, into our awareness. We feel your love moving through us. We draw upon your guidance. We draw upon your insight. As we relax into this moment, fully aware of your presence, our concerns seem not so great. Our appreciation magnified. Our healing facilitated. And for this we give thanks. And so it is that together we say, Amen. Well, the healing begins. I've been talking about this series beginning here for a couple of months. And so we have, I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that we have had a period of increased divisiveness in our country. And that divisiveness has filtered down to our communities, and it has filtered down to our families. I know for me, there are certain things that we just don't talk about in our family, amongst my brothers. Thankfully, my wife and my daughter and I are all on the same page, and the grandkids are coming up into that thought system, but it has been a challenge for many of us to carry on with our relationships as they existed 2 years ago. So our challenges are exacerbated by the political situation in our country. We have families that are torn. We have communities that are polarized. And we have a nation that is paralyzed with policy issues that seem to not have an opportunity for meeting in common ground. Well, a couple of weeks ago, we had the opportunity to have Sharif Abdullah. He is a fellow from Portland, Oregon. He grew up in Camden, New Jersey. He was in Camden. He was, shall we say, a challenging youth. He tells a story that when he was 11 years old, and this would be back in the late 50s, and because the internet was not around at that time, I couldn't find any way to verify this, but I trusted him at his word that the FBI actually detained him because there was some kerfuffle going on with the city council of Camden, and he was such a known entity, shall we say, in the Camden police force that the FBI brought him in for questioning about this issue with the Camden City Council. Now, he was 11 years old, okay? And he talks about in junior high, he had the opportunity to participate in what were called coat jobs. coat jobs was where a kid would be wearing a coat in the hallway. He'd be just kind of hanging out in the hallway, and on a random basis, a student would come down the hall, and this student would take off his coat, throw it over his head. Other people would grab this guy and start beating him, okay? So he was involved in this random acts of violence when he was in junior high school. So he came up through an environment that was very conflicted. And it was not until he got into college that he started to realize, that really wasn't an approach that was useful. And so as he became more involved in college, he became more involved in working as an activist to change things. He was intent upon changing things. As he moved through junior high and high school, he was very involved in changing the conditions for the blacks in the Camden community. And as he moved into college, he realized that, things aren't going so well for the whites in his class, that they were having problems also. And so he began to broaden his perspective that he wasn't just going to change things for the blacks, he was going to change things for the whites as well. And as he got out of college and got into professional life, he became involved in changing things for everybody, for the blacks, for the browns, for the yellows, for the whites. And over the course of his 40 years in his professional life, he has been focused on changing things for the better. Well, as I was researching this for this series, I had gotten a recommendation from a friend of mine for an interesting book. We'll come back to Sharif Abdallah here in a few minutes. I got a recommendation for a book that talked about the 11 nations of North America. And you probably think, well, actually, there's just 2 nations, aren't there? Canada and the U.S. Well, no, there's 11 nations, and we talk about those 11 nations. Do I have control? Why don't you advance the slide for me then? No, that was last week's. Y'all want to talk about last week's talk? No. Advance the slide again. Again. There we go. All right. So the 11 nations of North America are just from the top over on the right, the First Nations. Of course, the First Nations were the indigenous cultures. New France, Yankeedom, the Midlands, the light blue, the Midlands. The Tidewater, which was basically eastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Greater Appalachia, which was in the Appalachia area coming all over into the center of Texas. And then the Deep South. And you see New France up above. Well, there was also pilgrims from New France that came down and populated lower Louisiana. And then we have El Norte, which is the North people of Mexico, and they have filtered up into what is now Colorado. And then we have the left coast over here, and then we have the far west. And this book talks about the various values that were present in the founding fathers and mothers of these nations in the U.S. And the values were very different. As we look at Yankeedom and, the New Netherlands is right around New York. The Midlands, Tidewater, Greater Appalachia, and Deep South, all of these had a unique set of values that could be summarized with, could you plug me in, Patrick? Okay, I don't know where it is. Give me a slide then. So, Yankeedom, another slide, another entry. Come on, come on. No, back. Back. And there's nothing after that? Wow, okay. So, Yankeedom was founded by the Puritans. The Puritans were very much about proselytizing, right? They knew what was right, and they were willing to tell the world. The Puritans were particularly interested in the advancement of the community and the individual. We come down to the New Netherlands, and the New Netherlands. Give me the map back. Monica, could you give me the map back? Go up. My dongle was on my desk. Oh, okay. Give me the map back, please. Okay, so Yankeedom was founded in the Puritan ethic. Then we come down to the New Netherlands. Now, the New Netherlands were primarily the Dutch that settled in North America. And those people were primarily interested in commerce. But they also understood the value of infrastructure. So their commerce and their tax base were closely associated because they saw the need for government-funded infrastructure. The Midlands tended to be the Germans and the Quakers, and they were pretty much independent. They didn't want a whole lot of involvement from the government, but at the same time, they considered themselves to be self-sufficient. Tidewater. Tidewater is an interesting area because Tidewater was settled by the English aristocracy that were the second sons, the third sons of the family. Now, why is that important? Because primogeniture of culture of England insisted that it was the senior, it was the firstborn that inherited the land, right? So the second and third sons came to the U.S., but they wanted to maintain an aristocratic society. And so they were very much oriented to elitism. They were concerned about, how they looked, right, with their neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses. Greater Appalachia. Well, Greater Appalachia was founded by the tribes of Scotland and Ireland that were in conflict with Britain. So they were very much anti-government. Leave me alone, stay out of here, this is our area, right? Very tribal in nature. Then we have the Deep South. The Deep South was settled by the slave owners of Barbados. And the slave owners of Barbados brought the slavery into the country, and they used the agricultural means of Barbados and basically built the society on cotton farming. And then we have El Norte. These were people from Mexico that moved north. They were not inclined to the cultural attitudes of southern Mexico. They were more independent. They were more work-oriented, and they settled in this area here. Then the left coast. The left coast was settled by people who heard about the gold, and they flocked to the gold fields. And they were there was a tendency of people from Yankeedom to also settle in that left coast area, but But the proselytizing was not nearly as prevalent out here because there was a culture of diversity. Oh, by the way, New Netherlands was also oriented to cultural diversity. So we have all of these nations. Far West. Far West was actually the last to be settled. And it was last to be settled because the climate of the Far West was not nearly as receptive to agriculture, specifically the agriculture that was practiced in Yankeedom and in the Midlands because of the high desert, right? 12 inches of rain a year versus 60 inches of rain in the Midwest. So the Far West was much more dependent upon the corporate expansion. Major railroads, right? The railroads were given 100-foot swaths of land on either side of the rail line that they put through so that they could pay back. That was the pitch. We need to be able to pay back for our investment in these long train lines that don't go anywhere except west. So the Far West was settled because the banks that invested in the rail lines and the rail companies were given these huge chunks of land, about the size of Montana, it turns out, that were awarded to these various corporations. And so it was a very capital-intensive area, and the settlers were very dependent upon those corporations for movement of goods to and fro. So we have then these 11 nations, New France and First Nation, not particularly involved in or influential in the culture of the greater United States. Now, out of these various value systems, those value systems have actually been retained pretty well in those areas over the course of the 250, 300 years since the settling of these lands. And that was interesting to me, that the culture that we find in those areas is really rooted back to the people who founded it. Now, why is that important? I thought that was interesting. I thought that would bring this to you on a Sunday morning. But it's interesting because the values that we see in different parts of the U.S. really have an origin, and they really have a sustaining power in those various parts. So that as we in the Far West, and if we have lived here a while, we have picked up many of those values, right? But as we communicate with someone in the Deep South, there's a little bit different set of values, and those different sets of values are the basis of the worldviews. And the difference in worldviews is really the cause of our dissension. So if we can understand that these worldviews, the differences of worldviews, which are somewhat geographically dependent, or at least geographically inculcated, that these different value systems are really the basis of our of the dissension that we're seeing. So one of the things that comes out of this is that there is a tendency to be oriented to exclusivity. Sharif Abdullah talks about this. Patrick, could you give me a couple of slides forward, please? Again. Is this my current? Is this A? Okay. I don't think that this is presentation A. Look in the heading of that. No, this is not A. That's the problem. Pull up presentation A. I had dropped a new presentation on Patrick just before the prayer. Let's see, that's the one, yeah. Give me an advanced, cancel that. Give me an advanced down to, I don't know, slide 25 or 30, whatever it is. All right. Okay, let's just start there. Okay. All right, go back up one. Go back up one. Let's just In Appalachia, combative towards authority, skeptical of community investment in infrastructure, and skeptical of social engineering. Social engineering was very much part of the Yankeedom and part of New Netherlands. And then we have the far west, dependent upon federal resources, but reject federal involvement. That is, keep your nose out of my business, but give me your money. Okay, let's go on forward. All right, so in creating a world that works for everyone, works for all, Abdullah says, exclusivity is the root of all our human maladies. It allows us not only to separate from others, but also to oppress them. Racism, sexism, homophobia, slavery, all forms of hatred and bigotry stem from the notion, I am separate from you by virtue of skin color, ethnicity, behavior, belief, or whatever. So this sense of exclusivity is fuel for this divisiveness that we're experiencing. Next slide, please. So the solution here is that a world that works for all is not at all. A world that works for all is not achievable without restructuring our priorities, our attitudes, and our culture. We cannot tinker with this. The change must be fundamental, an evolutionary shift towards spiritual compassion and corresponding shifts in our actions. In short, a transformation of head, heart, and hand. So, who is responsible for that transformation of head, heart, and hand? We each are. Each of us is responsible for that. Identifying the fact that, yes, there is a reason for this divisiveness. It didn't just fall out of the sky on us 2 years ago. It actually has been part and parcel of our culture all along. But there's this thing called political correctness. Now, we may sneer at political correctness, but it turns out that political correctness is another word for social forces. Social forces are part and parcel of every community. You're going to have people that have a very divergent view of a particular issue. And it has been the social norm that we practice political correctness in the past. 2 years ago, that was kind of thrown out the window. And political correctness became something to be sneered at. But creating a world that works for all is going to require that we have a fundamental shift in our priorities, in our attitudes, in our values. Are we willing to conduct, to engage this healing? It really is up to each and every one of us. Each and every one of us in our families, in our communities, and in our nation. It is up to each and every one of us to be open to the worldviews of others. Not that we have to accept the worldviews of others, not that we have to agree with the values that others hold, but rather to be open to the understanding of where they're coming from. Because there are very few people in this vast country of 350 million, 335 million people that are interested in destruction for destruction's sake. They're interested in progress. They're interested in moving forward, Now, for some, moving forward may be reverting in time, right? For some, moving forward may be to engage some kind of social structure that has not been conceived of yet. Moving forward may, for some, be considered, hey, we're good right where we are, okay? So each of us is looking for an improvement in our own lives. The question is, what is our set of values? What is our worldview? And are we able to communicate with people that have different worldviews, that have different values? That is really the question. And the healing is not going to occur until we are willing to open ourselves to understanding where other people are coming from. It is absolutely important that we are willing to engage this shift. Another slide, please. And in the commentary on the Dhammapada is the Buddhist, if you will, fundamental Buddhist text. Eknath is Warren, who is he was a renowned author of Eastern and Western traditions. And in this commentary, he says that when the Buddha speaks, says in verse 5 in Dhammapada, for example, that hatred never ceases through hatred, only through love, he is, as he says, stating an eternal law which describes a binding, healing force. That binding, healing force is love. And it's not the contractual love that we're familiar with, but it's the unconditional love that Jesus was talking about. This unconditional love is a necessary impetus for us to cross over and understand the worldviews of others. And so in this healing process that we're going to be discussing over the next several weeks, in this healing process is going to be dependent upon our ability and our willingness to give unconditional love even to those who vehemently disagree with us. Whew. Are you up for it? It can be very challenging. I know that it can be very challenging with my brothers. But that's really my charge, right? It's my responsibility to bridge that gap until they recognize that it's also their responsibility to bridge that gap. But the healing is not going to begin until somebody moves. We have to be the movers. And you may have already had people approaching you in this effort to understand. If that has occurred, thank your lucky stars, because that's not happening very much right now. So it's up to us to make that move. And if we are willing to step forward into that, then we can, in fact, be practicing what Jesus offered. Next slide, please. In Matthew 5:38 to 42, he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Well, that's the kind of consciousness that is the basis of the divisiveness that we are experiencing now. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go the 2nd mile also. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. That's challenging, eh? Now, just as practice, I'm going to be standing at the door asking everybody for $200. Okay? No, I won't do that. All right. So he is offering us a revolutionary concept here. Turns out that this concept is actually rooted in Jewish tradition. But this concept is one that we just do not fathom here in this day and age. Are we willing to go the extra mile? Are we willing to offer our cloak? Are we willing to step into a strange territory and be willing to at least understand where the person is coming from? Are we willing to open a dialogue with someone who is vehemently in opposition to us? One of the things that you might practice over the course of this next week is identifying where your exclusives are. Where are your exclusives? What things do you exclude from your community? That is, from your circle of friends. What do you exclude? Do you exclude people that voted for whomever? That is, someone that you didn't vote for. Are you willing to include in your circle of friends someone of a different skin color? Most of us would say, of course. But think about that. You know, there was an example that Abdullah offered of describing when he was walking down the street in Moscow some 20 years ago. He was approached by 4 skinheads. Those skinheads apparently couldn't speak English, but they saw him coming and he saw them coming. And when they met, 2 of these skinheads stepped forward and started yelling at the top of their voice to this black man. And his response could have been, "Oh my God, I'm in a strange country. I've got 4 people that obviously could take me down if they wanted to. They might even kill me. I mean, I've heard about people getting killed and nothing being done here in this country." That was an approach, or that was a mindset that he could have had. But he had been practicing for 20 years or so this idea that unless you are willing to meet your opponent with acceptance, then you will likely be in for a battle. So his approach was, when he saw them coming and he anticipated how they were going to react to him, a large black man in Moscow, he looked upon them with acceptance. He looked upon them with a countenance of pleasantness. Not a smile, but a countenance of openness. And so when they approached him, and the two of the 4 stepped forward and started screaming at him, he was willing to stand there and receive that verbal abuse, not knowing what they were saying, but he was willing to stand there in that verbal abuse with an air of acceptance. And after a couple of minutes of this tirade coming from these 2 skinheads, they realized that he was not going to be cowed. He was not going to be moved. But he was also not resisting them. And they stepped back, and they looked him over, and with a humph, dismissing him, they walked on. Now, what was the key there? The key there was, in his mind, acceptance. Acceptance that this was the way it was. That there was nothing that he could do about it. He couldn't go back in time and take another route. He was there, they were there, and he was in a frame of acceptance. So the question is, can we approach our conversations with others in this air of acceptance? Are we willing to be open to that worldview? Are we willing to be open to that set of values being expressed? Are we willing to allow this conversation to take on whatever frame it might take on, but to be in a state of acceptance with it. Are you willing to walk the extra mile? Are you willing to offer the cloak as well? That's what Jesus is talking about. Back up, please. That's what Jesus is talking about. Are you willing to give to anyone who begs from you? Something to consider. Because this healing process is not going to be something where we flip a switch and all of a sudden rainbows come out and lambs start lying in the laps of lions and we all have this kumbaya experience. It's going to take effort from each and every one of us to be willing to step into the shoes of the other, to be able to accept their person, their worldview, their values, and not be required to abide by those worldviews, not be required to integrate those values, but be willing to be open to that expression. That's step one. We'll have our meditation. As we come into our meditation, let us come in with ourselves to be open to the presence. As we allow ourselves to be infused by this unconditional love that is always available to us. We breathe into this moment. We breathe into this mindset. We allow ourselves to be open and receptive to the worldviews of others, to the values of others. Allowing ourselves to be open and receptive to the passion of others. To stand tall in our own worldview and our own values without arguing, without trying to convince someone else, but rather to be receptive and focused on understanding. There is far more common ground between each of us than we are often aware. Can we find that common ground? Are we motivated to step into that common ground? I'm reminded of that passage from Rumi that says, out beyond the fields of right and wrong, there is a place. I'll meet you there. Are we willing to go beyond judgment? Are we willing to go beyond requirement? Are we able to open ourselves to inclusiveness without restriction? With these questions in mind, let us come back into this time and space, sharing the words of Alleluia.